for emergency services even though the laboratory's been flattened. And so functional damage means that can we continue to function? And so damage that results in a change, a loss of functioning of living creatures or the systems essential to societal function. So we can look at damaged bridges. We know that's structural damage, but then can we get the trucks across the bridge that we need to supply your hospital with drugs and water? Can we look at a collapsed hospital, whether they can continue to function or not? Contaminated wells, you can't drink the water anymore because it's contaminated from the event. And therefore, we can't get adequate water as a loss of function. When you have a loss of function, then that creates needs, because in order to get back to the function pre-event that was there before the event, it means it creates needs. I need to have X amount of water delivered. I need it now. And if I can't get it by land, I'll have to use helicopters or whatever to get the water in there that people need to survive. Because people don't do well without water. They do better without food for a while. They're hungry, and that may create violence, right, in efforts to get the food that's there. But we know we're going to need water regardless of the event. And those are needs. And needs are the differences between what you really have to have, requirements, and how much you've got. And that all results because some damage, physical damage has occurred that now impairs your ability to function. Now, the needs then may produce an emergency. And what we do here is if the needs are met by, I'm going to skip this because we'll come back to it. An emergency is when you're able to meet the demands, the needs, locally. It means here that your hospital is able to meet the needs that it perceives and increase needs because people are coming to the hospital with injuries, but all locally. They don't need help from outside of the city. They can do it all here. That's an emergency. An emergency occurs when an individual or society must use its response capacity, which we're going to define for you in a moment. And so here's a local response. I'm very impressed by the traffic here in Indonesia. My goodness, and all these little things running around on two wheels. How many of you drive these donor cycles? We call them donor cycles in my part of the country, my part of the world. How many of you ride motorcycles, primarily? Oh, come on. My God, all I got to do is look out there and I see people who are driving around on these things. Is there a helmet law in the city? Do you have to wear a helmet, supposedly? Really? Gee, I remember yesterday coming in from the airport, we saw a woman riding with her child in front, neither of them wearing helmets. We do not have a helmet law in the state of Wisconsin because we are home to Harley Davidson that makes these great big powerful motorcycles, and they were able to convince the legislature that people shouldn't have to wear helmets. It's astounding. Absolutely astounding. But they're great donors for organs, by the way. So we have better organ donation than most places. I assume you do as well. Anyway, the traffic here, how's this ambulance going to get through here? And you all know that's a problem. This is an event that happened in the stadium at a football game in our stadium. What happened is Wisconsin won a game that was really a championship game, and the students rushed the field. The problem was there were fences along the edge of the field, and they got trampled because the crowd came down against them and pushed people down against the fence, and eventually the fence fell over, and people were trapped under piles of 10, 12 people. And most of the people, we had at least 10 people who were pulseless non-breathing. They all survived, luckily, but even the football players helped to bring these people out. And most of these people, in fact, all of them were pulseless non-breathing, were women, because they had smaller chest walls, they were under all of this pressure, and they had essentially traumatic asphyxia. But they survived, but the psychological impact of that was phenomenal. People that were there that were picked up and moved down the bleachers without their feet on the ground were terrified. They wouldn't get on elevators, they wouldn't get on escalators. They were frightened to be around crowds of people. That's hard to account. That's really important, though. And this is, oops. This is what happened. This was a response. And these are ambulances from the city, but it's also important to recognize there were ambulances from outside of the city as well, which means that this may have been a disaster for us in the stadium. We had over 70 some odd people injured. They were all out of the stadium within 20 minutes of the event. But this was a terrifying experience for people. But the question is, this was an emergency for the county. It was not a disaster for the county. The problem comes when you're unable to meet the needs in terms of providing local responses locally. And if you need outside help from outside the area, then that's a disaster for the area that needs the help. That is a disaster. The disaster was when you need outside help. If you think about that in terms of individual patients, you can go all the way through this conceptual framework and think about your patients and how this applies to patients. Because I would suggest to you that people come in, usually following an event, they have some structural damage. What we find out, though, in assessing patients is we find out from their functional needs, their functional damage, because we detect changes in their physiology, right? That's what we look for. We look for what the cause of their pain is, but the pain is part of the functional change. We look and often we backtrack. The person having seizures or is unconscious, we go back and try and find out what the structural problem was from the loss of function. This is exactly what we do every day in taking care of patients. It's no different. So this shouldn't be difficult for you to get, because as you're doing assessments, and when you're doing physical assessments, you're looking for functional changes, right? That's what we detect in the laboratory. Unless it's trauma, when we look at traumatic injuries and we can see the damage with our eyes. But otherwise we say, well, this is related to all of this pain, and problem is related because the person has gallstones and has an inflamed gallbladder. That's the structure, but we get that from the functional, from detecting the functional differences, functional changes. Okay? So think about this when you're taking care of patients. That's the best way, I think, to remember it. So disaster is a disruption of a society or a component of society of such a magnitude that it needs to exceed the ability to cope without outside help. It overwhelms the local ability to take care of the patient. So what's going on here? We have to distinguish between these particular areas in the conceptual framework. We need to look at the hazard separate from the event. And really important is this, that the event is not the disaster. The event is not the disaster. The disaster is what happens to the society because of the event. So the volcanic eruption recently, which was an event, that was not a disaster. The event wasn't the disaster. It's what happened to the people. And how many people were displaced and taken out of their homes, etc. Those are all functional changes. And so we have to make sure, even though the media doesn't get it, right? The media calls the event a disaster. That's not the disaster. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. Disasters are not natural. It's what happens to the population. So the hazard was natural. It caused an event. And the event then was different. We created some structural damage, and then the functions of the society changed. And it was an emergency if you could handle it from within. But if we had to get outside help, that was a disaster for that group. In that tornado that I showed you, it was a disaster for the community that it struck. A disaster for the community that it struck. But it was not a disaster for the county around the community, because they could handle it just fine. So think about when you have a disaster in your own life, because that means you need outside help. And one of them is studying for an exam and you can't quite get it, and you got to go get somebody else to help you with it. That's a disaster, right? You never had that problem, not sure. So the important lesson here is the event is not the disaster. If you don't take anything else away from this morning, please keep that in mind. And next time you read a newspaper about an event and about something that happens, laugh when they call it just laugh and say, well, they don't know what they're